This week? Good. Good. I came back to church utterly spent and depressed. We went to UCF campus this week, and I wasn't depressed about UCF. It's not Florida State, but I went to UCF, and for those of you that don't know, me and Mary have had the honor, the privilege, the grace of God to raise 5 girls, and so we took our baby over to the campus, and she's going to be moving into the campus there in Orlando in a couple of weeks. But we went over there for orientation. We've been there for a couple of days, and it's just something about the last one. Like there's a lot of freedom in that, and I'm excited that me and Mary are going to have finally that time that we can spend together before another child moves back in with us. But I'm excited about that. But it's been a week. It's been a week, to say the least. And so happy to be here today. And then after speaking of moving back in, after service today, when we get broke down and stuff like that, me and Mary hit back on the road, and we're going to drive 4 hours up to pick up Ray's kids and bring them back with us tonight. And so lots of things going on with family, which is exciting, but also being transparent, draining, right? Like family's draining, but they're also amazing. So lots going on. But today, before we do all of that, today we're going to get the privilege of diving into God's Word. And we've been going verse by verse through Hebrews. Today we're going to complete all of Hebrews. We're finishing up in Hebrews 13. And there's a lot that's been going on in Hebrews, but we titled this sermon series as being Rooted. And so today's actual title for the sermon is Rooted, because it's going to be a reminder of what it is that the writer of Hebrews has been directing to us to do in our life. Now, we didn't go over this a lot during the time. We did it at the beginning of the series and maybe a couple times in between, but not a whole bunch. But being rooted is this symbolism, this analogy that occurs over and over in the New Testament of a comparison between our faith, our Christian walk, and this analogy, this picture of a tree. Over 26 times in the Bible, there's an analogy made between faith and a tree. And then further in the New Testament, 22 more times, there's this symbolism, this metaphor, this analogy that's made with bearing fruit that continues that idea of being a tree. Well, the thing about trees is that you really don't know how healthy a tree is from observing it above ground. It looks green, it looks big, but you don't really know if it's dying or not unless you can examine its roots. Because that's where life begins, that's where life thrives, that's where death begins, that's where death thrives, is in the roots of a tree. Now, years and years and years ago when I was working with my dad, and we had an excavation, not an excavation service, but we had heavy equipment company, and we would do all kinds of different things and everything, but every once in a while they would require us to clear land. And you would go in there with the heavy equipment, and you would knock over trees, and then you would clear up the land and everything, and you pile the trees up, and you'd burn the trees off, and then whatever's left of that you would bury, and so on and so forth. But a lot of times, if you picture clearing trees, I don't know exactly how you think you would go about doing like a large wooded area. Maybe you think you'd go in there with a chainsaw. That's a lot of work. Maybe you think you'd go in there with a bulldozer and just push them over. It's very hard to push a tree over. Most trees, pine trees would push over pretty easy, but it's hard to because the root system is expansive up under there, and it's just hard to push one over. You would go in there with an excavator or a backhoe, and you would dig it up with the bucket around the roots, and you break those roots up, and you dig this ball out around this tree so that you could push it over then. That's what you would do. And then you would take the excavator and you would break the tree up and you pick it up and you put it on the pile. But the roots would tell you a lot about the tree. And so we've been looking at being rooted. That's what the author is trying to tell us, is that it's important in our faith to be rooted, to concentrate on our roots. Now down here in Florida, sandier ground is hard to tell, but the roots kind of expand out further because they're not in clay. They have to keep spreading and keep searching to get themselves grounded so that the hurricanes and everything else don't blow them over. And so like recently, a year or so ago, I planted an orange tree because you're not truly a Floridian unless you have an orange tree. I just didn't feel right about it. I'm still this peach guy. So I got an orange tree. We got it planted. It's growing fine. But here's the funny thing about orange trees or any tree, period. When you're looking to grow fruit, you're not focusing on the fruit. You're focusing on the roots. You're watering them. You're feeding them. You're making sure that the weeds don't strangle everything around it and everything. You don't go and say, okay, I want an orange tree, so I'm just going to focus up here around the leaves where these little white buds are going to come in, and then that's not your focus. Your focus in making that tree healthy is all about attention to the roots. And it's the exact same way in our life. In our spiritual walk, it's the exact same way. Too many times we're told, okay, well, if it means this to be a Christian, you should be out helping the homeless, you should be out taking care of widows, you should be doing all this stuff. And so we focus on the fruits. And what we lose sight of is if we take care of the roots, the fruit will come. The fruit is a demonstration that you're taking care of the roots. And so today we're going to finish up because there's a couple of things that he finishes up in his closing that points to the signs of healthy roots, of taking care of healthy roots. The first one of those signs is that we have confidence in God. Right? We're taking care of the roots by relying upon God, by placing our confidence in Him. There's so many things going on in the world that wants to take our confidence away. So many things. In our own personal life, on a daily basis, we run into relationships that scare us, that place fear in us because of what might happen in that relationship. In our jobs, we're worried about our careers. We're worried about what our boss is going to say. We're worried about our pay. We're worried about different things that men can do. In our country, we're extremely worried about the results of things that men can bring about. But the Bible says that one of those healthy displays of faith is when our confidence is placed in God. In Hebrews 13:6 it says, so we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? This is very healthy faith. When we can walk around no matter what's going on in the world around us, no matter what's going on in our community, no matter what's going on in our relationships, when we realize that we may live in difficult times, we may face difficult things, but we're okay because our confidence is placed in God. Not in man-made things, not in things of man. We went through a couple of weeks ago a particular section of Hebrews where it taught, and we called it the halls of faith. We didn't coin that. That is something that is referred to because we're going through all these people and the history of the people that have God accredited their walk to their faith, right? And we looked at Abraham, and we looked at Joshua, we looked at Rahab, we looked at David, we looked at different people as we were going through this, and we could see that God accredited their life to their faith. Well, you know another name that we could have gave to the Hall of Faith? It could have been just the account of times that God rescued people, because it's the same thing, right? God rescues us. Have you been rescued by God? Have you had moments in your life of where you've had doubt, where you had hardship that you faced? You had fear. And as you were going through that and you're wrestling with that, God stepped in and He rescued you from that. He rescued you from what felt very overwhelming, what felt out of control. Well, the halls of faith is another way of looking at that. When we look at those people, when we look at Noah, and we look at David, and we look at Solomon, we look at different people, we look at Samson, when we look at Deborah, we look at the judges, we look at any of those accounts in the Bible, they had faith, but they also, a lot of their accounts were accounts of where God stepped in and rescued them. And I dare say that I absolutely say that God is still in the rescuing business. And He still steps into our life and He rescues us in circumstances all the time. Sometimes, though, we are so very thankful that it happens, but then we get busy about doing our life again, and we make less and less and less of it. And when we make less and less and less of it, we don't live in a way that's appreciative of it. We don't live in a way that demonstrates how big God is. And when we don't live in a way that demonstrates how big God is, the world seems bigger and bigger. It's a challenge in our life to go through our life and to make sure that we engrave those things on our heart. Make sure we journal those things. Make sure that we are reminded of those things that God rescues us from. Take an account of those things, so that when you face things in life, like the things that are going on in our world today, that you're not sitting there and you have a bigger picture of the world than you have of God. That you're so overwhelmed by what might be happening at your work. You're so overwhelmed what might be happening inside your own household. You're so overwhelmed with the relationships outside. You're so overwhelmed with what's happening in politics. You're so overwhelmed with what's going on in other countries that you're living in fear that seems so big and that can affect you to such a greater extent that you no longer recognize how big God is. And that in all the things that you're facing in life, God is bigger. And if you just simply place your confidence in Him, you'll be okay. You'll be steady. Psalms 118, 4-7 says, "Let those who fear the Lord say, His steadfast love endures forever. Out of my distress I called on the Lord. The Lord answered me and set me free. The Lord is on my side. I will not fear. What can man do to me? The Lord is on my side as my helper. I shall look in triumph on those who hate me." There's nothing that anyone can do. There's no circumstance that the world can throw in our path. There's nothing that can happen that's bigger than God. Oh, to live as a child again, right? To live as a child again. I said at the beginning that this has been a crazy weekend, but raising those girls and everything, I can remember that with the baby this week, when you're going through a moment like that, you think about all the things and steps through life and everything, and I can remember taking her to school for the first day, and I can still remember her little bitty hands wrapped around my finger as we were walking up to class, right? I can still remember teaching her how to ride a bike because she wanted to ride a bike. But the day that we were going to teach her how to ride a bike, she was scared to death. She'd been thinking about it the night before. We're going to learn how to ride a bike the next day, right? And she's scared to death because she's going to fall over. Now, when I'm talking about ride a bike, I'm not talking about leaning on the training wheels. They did that almost from the start, right? They're leaning left and right on the training wheels and stuff like that. But she knew we were taking the training wheels off. She's going to learn how to ride it without a training wheels, right? And during that night, she was worried about it. That next day, she was worried about it, but she was also kind of excited. But it was the biggest fear she was facing. And she was like, what if I fall down, Daddy? What if I hurt myself and all this and everything? And that's where her fear was at. And during the entire process of learning to do it without training wheels, I was right there with her, right? I'm holding the handles, and I'm holding the seat, and I'm running alongside of her until I can't. But because she gets too fast and I'm fat. But you're running alongside of her and you're holding on to it and everything. And eventually, she would get to the point of where she just needed me to be close right there, right? And before long, she's doing it and she doesn't recognize that I'm not right there beside her until she does. And then she freaks out and she wrecks because she expected me to be right there beside her. But for so many minutes, she was riding that bike because she had confidence that I was right there. I wasn't, but she had confidence that I was right there. It wasn't until she no longer had confidence that she was in trouble. Man, God's never not there. He's never not there. There's not a time where that occurs. You can place your confidence in God and go about life. I don't care if you're facing hills or valleys or there's ruts in the road. Your confidence is well placed in God. Secondly, the author of Hebrews goes through this passage and he talks about one of the things that we need to do is have respect for leaders. In Hebrews 13:7 it says, "Remember your leaders, those who spoke to you the word of God. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith." And then later in Hebrews 13:17 it says, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you." Seems perfectly self-serving for me to tell you that you should listen to leaders of faith, right? Fortunately for me, we've been preaching verse through verse through Hebrews, and so unless I selected Hebrews just to get to this point, then we're just going and following God's word, right? So those that lead in spiritual matters, he says it's important that we should listen to them. Are there individuals that are self-serving? Yes. Are there bad leaders? Yes. Does God call for our discernment? Absolutely. But also God asked us to follow spiritual leaders in our life and to listen to them and to imitate those things that are good. 1 Thessalonians 5:12 through 13 says, "We ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Be at peace among yourselves." So respect and support your leaders. This is another healthy sign of your faith. Third, and this goes back to the confidence in God. Third, take comfort and depend upon this, the unchanging nature of Christ. Hebrews 13:8 through 9 says, "Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. Do not be led away by diverse and strange teachings, for it is good for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by foods which have not benefited those devoted to them." This particular definition of Jesus Christ not ever changing is immutability, right? He never changes. There's nothing about Christ that ever changes. His character will be the same today. It will be the same tomorrow. It will be the same forever. And that should be somewhat of a comfort for us, right? In a world that constantly changes, that should be somewhat of a comfort for us. It should be a large comfort because everything changes. Every single thing changes in our life. I guess I'm going to just use this scenario all morning because it's what's on my mind. But with my daughters, right? I change. There will come a point in time, and has come a point in time in my other daughter's life, of where I'm no longer the man in their life, right? They'll meet someone and they'll fall in love and they'll be disappointed because that person's never as good as daddy. But they'll meet that person, right? And they'll start depending on that person, and things will change. And my relationship with them changes. My love doesn't change, but my relationship changes. And then there'll be times in life of where I used to could do things that I can't do anymore. I'm just not physically capable of doing all the things that I do. That doesn't mean my love has changed, but the situation's changed. And in all our lives we have that. We have friends that were our closest friends in kindergarten. We can't hardly remember their name anymore. But they were amazing then, right? They were our ride or die. Now we have different friends. And in 20 years, our life's going to look even more different, right? And that's the way life is, because things in our life change. We change. Christ never changes. He never changes. And no matter what's going on in our life, it's a comfort that we can come back to that and know that, and there's security in that. It's kind of like a lighthouse. You can go out on the water, right? You can go out on the water 1,000,000 times and still not know everything about the ocean, because another day may come where it's totally different. But the cool thing about lighthouses is that lighthouses are always in the same place. And you can depend upon where they're at. And if you see that light, you know exactly where you're at, no matter if it's storming, no matter if there's a hurricane, no matter if it's calm, no matter if it's foggy. If you can see the light, you know with certainty that it's in the exact same place. Christ is always in the same place, and you always have availability to Him, and you can always depend upon Him. Malachi 3:6 says, "For I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore you, O children of Jacob, are not consumed." Then the author of Hebrew, as he's closing down, moving towards the benediction, he talks about a call to live in a certain way, right? Of holiness and sacrifice. In Hebrews 13, 15 through 16, it says, "Through Him, then let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is, the fruit of lips that acknowledge His name. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God." Now this echoes, is very reminiscent of what we have in Romans 12. Because Paul writes in Romans 12:1, "I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship." Now what we're getting back to here is the way in which we live. And the way in which we live is not focused on fruit, but on roots. I'm going to give you an example. Several years ago, me and Mary were at another church, and we had a Ugandan choir come in. And they were doing a ministry, and they brought the kids in and some of the adults and stuff like that. But they came in, and they were raising money for a church in Uganda. And one of the things that really stood out to me is that one of the choir individuals was sharing a story, because they said something that was funny. And I always like picking up on stuff because, well, not today. We have visitors today that wouldn't make fun of my accent. But most of the time, people make fun of my accent, and they're like, "Oh, you say the weirdest things and stuff like that." No, you're weird. Okay, but this one time, this woman was saying something, so I pick up on stuff that people say from their hometown, like, I don't know, point out weirdness. I also think my wife's got some weird stuff. She's from Roanoke, Alabama, and they call water hoses hose pipes. That's weird. But like people say different things, and it stands out to me when they do. And one of the things that they said is these kids were getting ready for bed, and they were encouraging them to pray, and the leader was a she, and she said to them and everything, "Don't let your path grow up." And I was like, what does that mean? How does that relate to encourage them to pray? Don't let your paths grow up. And so I asked her about it. And she said in their village, they live in small homes. Probably what we would call huts, even though they're concrete and everything. But there's 8 to 12 people in the houses, in small houses. They don't have separate bedrooms or anything like that. And so when they come to know Christ, they find it very important that they have their prayer times. I do too. I think that's great. But what they would do is, instead of, since their homes are so crowded and their little villages are so crowded, that they would go off into the woods, into the jungle, into the area around them, and they would find private places to pray. And normally that was their place, right? That they would go and pray, their prayer spot. Well, you could tell when someone belonged to Christ because they would wear a path out through the weeds, through the trees, through everything, to their prayer spot. But you also could tell and hold them accountable when their path would start growing back up. You knew they weren't spending as much time with Christ, right? In that scenario, I want you to understand something. The prayer isn't the fruit. It was the path, right? Because in the path was what their witness was. Not that they were actually praying. They should be praying. But you could see the path. Now, so many times when we think about our witness, that's exactly how it occurs. We're concentrating on everything out here. We're like, oh, God calls me to be a good witness. So what does that mean? And I'm looking at the projection of things. I'm looking at the things in front of me, what I'm projecting out. That means that I should show up to church. That means that if we're having a homeless outreach of a feeding station or whatever, I need to be there for that. And you should. But you're thinking of that as your witness. And you're thinking that I need to do certain things on a checklist for my witness. I need to be dressed up for Sunday. I need to go to this life group. I need to do this outreach, and I need to do all this, and all of this stuff out in front of you. And when you would say in your mind, if you go this far, when you're thinking in your witnesses that there are some things you might be lacking on, you think, well, if somebody just asked me about it, I can argue and defend myself and explain why that is, why I might not fit their model. So everything that we think about with our witness, for the most part, is projection. That's not our witness. What we see about ourselves, what we think about ourselves, normally doesn't match our witness at all. It's the things that are behind us that's our actual witness. It's the things that are on the path behind us that we leave behind that develop the fruit. We don't get the opportunity to argue with other people about why we're so godly. We don't get the opportunity to tell other people our resume. All we get is what they see. That's all we get. That's all that's guaranteed. And guaranteed that every single person that's sitting down in here today has a witness. Now, whether that witness is for God or for the world, I cannot tell you, but you have a witness. And you're leaving a path behind you. And that is what people see. Not what you prefer them to see, but how you actually live. That's your witness. James 1:27 says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and keep oneself unstained from the world. Notice how these two are intertwined. To visit the orphans and the widows and take care of those in need, but to keep oneself unstained. This is the attention to the roots. This is the fruit. When you're dedicated and you're focused on your relationship with God, all the fruits will follow. Your witness will be stout. Your walk and the path that you leave behind will be visible, and it will point towards God. But your intentions don't matter as much. If your intentions are, well, I really love God, I really do. I love God, but I also love Danny Lewis. I also love Florida State. So there's so many, and this is not true for visitors. I'm always here on Sunday. But like, there's so many Sundays I'm going to miss because Florida State plays on Saturday night, and it's hard to get back to church and everything. So let's just get somebody to come in and speak, or let's ask somebody to stand up so that I can go and watch Florida State games, so I can see the Chief come out, which we have to all argue is the greatest mascot. He come out and spear the ground in front of everybody because that's the coolest thing. I'm glad glad y'all all agree. But like Florida State, all about that life and everything. But man, really, truly, honestly, I love God. And if anybody would ask me, if anybody would take the time, they would know it's God first, then my wife, then family, and then Florida State. No, that's not what people see. If I start missing church and all I talk about from the pulpit is Florida State, and I start missing church so that I can go to games and everything, it doesn't matter what my mouth says is my God. My actions say, this is my God. And that's all that really matters. That's what I'm witnessing to. I can have a defense in my head. I can have the greatest of intentions, period, towards what I believe, but my witness is actually what I do. That's my witness. And the only way that I can have a good witness is not with intentions, not focusing on the fruit, but making sure the roots are healthy. That's the only way. Because my witness has got nothing to do with what I do. It's got everything to do with my proximity to Christ. In this passage, the writer of Hebrews ends it with this benediction. He says in Hebrews 13, 20 through 21, now may the God of peace, who brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep, by the blood of the eternal covenant, equip you with everything good that you may do his will, working in us that which is pleasing in his sight through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. Notice that equip you. When we draw closer to Christ, when we are in that close proximity, when we're walking with him, when we're concentrating on that relationship, when we're pouring into those things, taking care of the roots, he is the one that equips us for everything. And Philippians 2:13 says, for it is God who works in you, both to the will and to the work for his good pleasure. It's God. And so, from the very beginning, all the way through Hebrews, over the first third, almost half of Hebrews is set forth to convince us that Jesus is greater. Jesus is greater than men. Jesus is greater than the supernatural. Jesus is greater than Moses. Jesus is greater than the law. The whole first concentration of Hebrews is all about making sure that we understand that Jesus is greater. And then, over the next third of it is pointing towards what it looks like when we walk in that faith. But this last section right here is how. When you pop through that bubble and the first thing that you're turning to is no longer the world. It's no longer, oh, I'm facing this and I need to Google it. And I'm turning to God because I know that he's greater. And I know all the things that God's going to do in my life because I've seen his example through history. I've seen his example through the Bible. I've seen his example in my own life working. Then what is the call on your life then? It's to draw closer to him. And how do I do that? By the fundamentals, right? The fundamentals of placing my confidence, my faith in God. My confidence of living in his statutes, listening to those who are teaching those things, listening to the Bible, spending my time there. These are the things that we're called to do. These are the things that strengthen us. You know what doesn't strengthen us? You know what the greatest threat to any one of you is? You. Jesus was talking to his disciples and he shared this parable, and in this parable he says that the greatest will be my mind went blank. Y'all know my ADHD. Matthew 20 said the last will be first and first will be last, right? And when he's talking about that, I don't know how many times I've heard that, and we put our own thoughts on that. So the first will be last and last will be first. Well, who do you think that's referring to? Do you think that when you think of the people that are first, do you think of people that are obnoxious? Do you think of people that are rich? Do you think then all of a sudden that the meek will rule the world, and so the last are the meek and the first are the rich, and so on and so forth? No, you know who the first are? You know who the first are in your life? I can guarantee it without knowing anything about you. Nothing about you. I don't even know you, fiance from Georgia. I know nothing. But do you know who the first is in our lives? Ourselves. That's who we put first. That's who we're taught to put first from the moment that we start. We're in competition with everybody else around us, and we live that way, and we put ourselves first. And Jesus over and over again has this message for us that if we want to truly experience His life, it's about denying ourselves, right? We won't experience God until we place ourselves last. But we spend too much time placing ourselves first. Won't experience the fruits, won't experience this authentic life that God has for us. We won't experience this abundant life that Christ said was His mission to bring to our life until we start taking care of the roots and instead of focusing on the world and instead of focusing on ourselves, focusing on our relationship with God. That's the challenge that's before all of us, to make sure that we're leaving a witness that points to God. So this morning, and I said it like in the second point, this morning I guess the challenge that I lay before you is to live in such a manner that you keep in mind who God is in your life. Journal those rescues. Journal those moments that God intervenes in your life and live in those. Don't let this world bring you down. Live in your confidence of Him. And then go out and take those opportunities to bring Him glory. This morning, I'm going to ask Matthew if he'll come down. And as he comes down, that's the challenge, right? The challenge is to live in a manner worthy of Christ.